Welcome to tonight's Bannon Forum conversation with Dr. Norman Wurzba. My name is Aaron Willis, Director of the Bannon Forum and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education, and I'm happy you all could join us here tonight. The Bannon Forum serves as a place to explore the Jesuit mission and tradition of Santa Clara and to seek to answer the question of what it means to be a Jesuit university. Our event tonight, Reimagining Creation, Agrarianism, Theology, and Ecological Responsibility, offers us a moment to reflect on our drive to create a more just, humane, and sustainable world. The conversation today will span a range of topics that touch on all three of these aims, but most importantly, it will explore how we can think of strengthening our relationships as a means to fulfilling our mission. How can we heal a broken world through reimagining our relationships with each other, with the food we eat, and with creation more broadly? This intentional focus on relationality as a part of a broad and inclusive theology is at the core of Ignatian spirituality and the mission of our institution. And so because of this, I'm so thrilled that we were able to bring this conversation to you all. And I'm grateful to Dr. Wurzba, Catherine Ronthaler, and Dr. Paul Schutz for engaging in this important dialogue. Before I introduce Paul and we start our event more formally, I want to mention that if you want to ask questions during the event, feel free to enter questions into the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your Zoom windows. And you can enter those at any point, and we can always come back to those. They won't disappear. So feel free, if something strikes you, to go ahead and put your question in and just get it in the queue so we can come back to it later. And we will have time for more questions at the end. So don't feel like you need to get it in to get answered. So now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Paul Schutz, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at Santa Clara and the interim associate director of the graduate program in pastoral ministries. A native of Evansville, Indiana, Paul received his BA in English, Music, and Film Studies from Boston College and his MA and PhD in Systematic Theology from Fordham University. His research focuses on the relationship between religion and ecology, with an emphasis on how contemporary scientific knowledge grounds and informs humanity's relationship with the natural world and other than human creatures. A longtime liturgist and musician, his work also addresses the potential of Christian worship and biblical accounts of creation, life, and love for cultivating a robust praxis of ecological and social justice. And I'd also like to say that Paul is integral in formulating this event and our interlearners panel next week. And so I just want to say I appreciate all the time and efforts to make this happen. And I'll hand it over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thanks back to you, Aaron, for all of your work in bringing this together. When you came to me with the idea, what was it, a couple of months ago now, to put together a couple of events around ecological responsibility, I was really excited for that work. And when, Aaron, it was your idea to first mention this theme of agrarianism, at least for one of them, the person that immediately came to my mind is a person whose work I've admired and taught and worked with. In fact, a person whose work my students in one of my classes are reading right now, last week and this week, who is Dr. Norman Wurzba, who's with us as well. And in addition to Norman, as you know, Aaron mentioned Catherine Ronthaler, who is the garden manager of our own sustainable and organic garden here at SCU, the Forge Garden. And it looks, from the folks that are here, like a lot of our students and folks that we work with in doing this work are here with us. And so welcome to everybody. It's so good to have all of you with us tonight. So I'm going to just say a quick word about the format for tonight, and then I'll introduce our two other speakers and we'll go from there. So the event tonight is slated for about 90 minutes, and we're a few minutes in already, of course. After these introductions, Dr. Wurzba is going to open with a talk, which will kind of introduce the themes of the night, the connections that Aaron was alluding to in his opening remarks. After that, we're going to sort of turn it into a conversation between all of us who are gathered here, but principally at the beginning between Catherine, Norman, and I. And we'll talk about some themes. We'll unpack them theologically from the standpoint of agrarian life, connect them with the practices of gardening and farming that so inform the work that the Forge does here at SCU, and we'll put everything together in that way. And during that time, as Aaron mentioned, we invite you, as you're welcome to throughout the event, to send us your questions, your comments through the Q&A function. And as our conversation unfolds, we'll start to bring those in as well and start to have some good conversation around the things, the questions and comments that you all raise as well. So you're welcome to be participants in this conversation. We want to have that relationship with you as we go on tonight. So that is kind of the format of the event. Our speaker, featured guest speaker here who will open us up is Dr. Norman Wiersbe. And Norman grew up farming in southern Alberta up in Canada. He, after growing up there, ended up doing a PhD in philosophy and now teaches courses in theology and the environment at Duke University in North Carolina, where he is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Theology and also a senior fellow at Duke's Keenan Institute for Ethics. He's currently directing a multi-year, multidisciplinary project called Facing the Anthropocene, a project that rethinks the basic assumptions about the meaning of our world and humanity's role within it. And you can find out more about that on Duke's website and on Twitter. There are lots of heads up about coming events in that series. He's the author of several books, including The Paradise of God, Living the Sabbath, Food and Faith, and From Nature to Creation. He just finished a new manuscript as well, entitled This Sacred Life, Humanity in a Wounded World, which will appear later this year in the fall. So it's great to have you with us, Norman. Thank you for joining us today. Our other conversation partner is Catherine Rondhaler, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the director manager of the Forge Garden here at SCU. Catherine discovered her love of farming while studying environmental studies and biology at UC Santa Cruz. She went on to work in the field of sustainable agriculture and agricultural education at Full Circle Farm, the HEAL Project, and Education Outside. She's worked at the garden manager of the Forge since 2015 and completed her MS in sustainable food systems at Green Mountain College. Catherine is passionate about building a just and sustainable food system, and her favorite part of the job is working with students, many of them here with us, as they discover their passion for good food and farming and how those things can come together. And I know that that last part, the good food and farming, is something that the three of us have already connected about in our conversations about this event. And in a special way is a connection that has emerged out of my own classes, because as I mentioned earlier on, I teach Dr. Wiersbe's book, The Paradise of God, in a course called Sustainable Theologies that I teach here at Santa Clara. And as with many of my classes, in that class, whenever we're not under the constraints of COVID, we actually read and discuss with my students one of the chapters of The Paradise of God while in the Forge Garden. And on those days, Catherine has always been so generous to introduce the garden and its programs, to give us a tour, let us sample some of the great stuff that's growing there, and to really have that experience of thinking theologically about our interrelatedness, the act of gardening, being in the garden, hearing the sounds, tasting the tastes, having that full experience while actually being present in a garden. And I know that's something that I really miss, and to my students who are here, it's something I really wish that we could be doing together as we have in the past. So that's one part of tonight's event that makes things very special for me. And so it's a real delight to be together with both Catherine and with Norman tonight. So with all of that introduction complete, and once again welcoming everybody to join us, thank you for being with us. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Norman Wiersbe, who will share some thoughts with us to begin.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul. It's really wonderful to be with you. I wish I could be in California itself. I've seen pictures of your campus and it looks really, really wonderful. What I want to do tonight is I want to talk to you a little bit about agrarian themes as they emerge in culture, but also in the way we think about theology or spirituality more generally. Because I think it's important to understand that to talk about an agrarian life doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a farmer. In fact, it's pretty clear that for the future, we're going to need a number of people living in cities who have what I will call agrarian sensitivities or sensibilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those are, because the future of our food producing lands, our lumber producing lands, really depends on each of us as consumers, because the choices we make determine the kind of agriculture we have, the kind of forestry we have, also the kind of energy systems we have. So if you want to think about a simple definition for an agrarian, you could say simply, an agrarian is someone who cares about the health of land and people together, not the health of people at the expense of land, but the health of people and land together. So mutual flourishing is the goal. And I think what we need to appreciate right at the start is that we're in an unprecedented situation in the history of the world, because if you think for thousands of years, the vast majority of people lived from the land. And I mean this in the sense that they were either hunters, they were foragers, or they were agricultural people, often mixtures of all three of those at the same time. And so you could almost assume that people had what we would call a culture of the land, because they knew that their well being, they knew that their economic forms, their social organization, these sorts of things depended upon a kind of attunement to what the land says, what the land speaks. And that's so very, very important to appreciate, because if you don't know what the land is, what the land needs, it's quite likely that you'll engage in economic practices that will do it a fair amount of damage. And I think this is a situation where we find ourselves in today, where so many of our lands are in significant decline, or are exhausted, or simply abandoned. And this is a truly unfortunate thing, because it's not simply that we're destroying our lands, it's also that we are really impairing our ability as human beings to understand ourselves as earth-bound beings, as creatures, if you want to use theological language. And I'm not talking about something that is simply a pious sort of notion. I'm talking about something that's very fundamental to what people think and believe about themselves. And I'll just give you an example from a person I've gotten to know a little bit, and whose work you all must read if you don't know. This is Robin Kimmerer, who is an indigenous botanist and writer who lives in New York State. And she wrote this utterly fabulous book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in it, she describes what it was like for her to go into a PhD program to learn biology and botany, and discover that the way scientists were talking about plants was so different than the way her elders were talking about plants, and the way they were talking about the land at the same time. And what she does in this book is give a description about what it means to understand yourself as being kin with other creatures, with plants, with animals, but also with the land itself. And she makes this truly remarkable observation when she says that the folks who came to North America, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they came to the land with the objective to possess it and really to control it. And we know the story that goes with that. And she said, what is so tragic about this posture that people took toward the land is that they could no longer feel themselves as coming out of the land and also being loved by the land. Now, that might seem a bit romantic to talk about the land loving you, but she says it's truly remarkable. And this is where the experience of gardening, which we'll get a chance to talk about later, is so important, because the work of gardening is this work where you take your skill, your attention, and your care to try to see what you can do with some soil, with some plants, and see what kind of fruit or flowers you can grow. And the remarkable thing is that when you give your care and devotion to the land provides for you beauty. It provides for you food. It provides so many of the sort of sensory experiences that bring us so much joy when we're in a garden. And she says that when people don't have the experience of knowing that the land that they are on loves them and cares for them, and that human beings belong in that land, they're going to need to do all sorts of compensatory strategies to feel loved. And we know what it's like, I think, for people who grow up in social atmospheres where they don't sense that they've been loved either by parents or peers, it's really rough to grow up in that sort of a world. And what Kimmerer allows us to do is ask the question, what happens to people when they don't believe that the land is a place that cares for them? And that if they give their care to it, there can be something like mutual flourishing. She thinks that something of a psychic disturbance develops in people, and people feel lonely, they feel alienated. And so we have a number of writers now who are talking about how one of the most urgent needs that people seem to have is not just to reconnect with nature, but to go deeper and to feel a kind of kinship with nature so that they sense that their own well being is intimately tied to the well being of the land that feeds them. Now, as I said, this is a trend that we're seeing, but it's going against a fairly long history in which people have not paid attention to their dependence upon the land. In fact, many of the assumptions of the ways we build our cities, our towns, our infrastructures, our built environments assume that people live on the land, but not from the land. And that's a crucial distinction because if you think you simply live on the land, that means you could go somewhere else and life would be just as fine. And the extent to which we'll go in our thinking that we can go somewhere else and be fine is now reflected in the idea that we see in engineers and futurists who are advocating that what people need to think about is how this planet will not be able to sustain human life for a great deal longer. And so we need to terraform other planets. We need to re-engineer lunar landscapes so that we can have a home there. And the tragedy in this whole way of thinking is it completely misunderstands how intimately tied our bodies are to the ecosystems of this planet. And just to give you one example of this, we've recently made some discoveries about how the human body is so finely tuned to all of the bodies around us, whether those be plant bodies or animal bodies or insect bodies. But you may have heard talk about the gut biome that are in every person's body. This is a hugely important feature of our gastrointestinal systems. And what you discover when you read about the gut biome is that your body is not your own, that your body, in fact, is a host to billions upon billions of microorganisms. And so I try to tell my students as a way to understand this idea, and that is to say that you are not a you are actually a zoo because you are host to such a great diversity and multitude of life within you. And what scientists have discovered is that the gut biome that is within us is almost analogous to the biome that we have in our soils. And so, how we see our own health is very closely tied to the health of what's going on in the soil. And insofar as we have agricultural practices or building practices that destroy the microbial life in soils, that degrade its carbon content, we do damage to ourselves. And so the idea that human beings are somehow separate from the land, can simply move about it, and perhaps even move away from it entirely, rests upon a fundamental misunderstanding of our own physiology. The idea that we would want to go to Mars to live there would basically require us to bring the whole biome of Earth to Mars at the same time. And I don't think anybody believes that that's a feasible project. So if going to another planet is an option, what do we need to think about instead? And I think this is where the agrarian way of understanding human life becomes so important. Because from an agrarian point of view, we work on the land, we work with the land, we work with creatures so as to understand how to bring ourselves into greater sympathetic alignment with land and creatures and water and forests, because we can't survive, let alone flourish, for very long if we exist in an antagonistic relationship to these natural realities. So we have to figure out, how are we going to discover the mechanisms, the practices, the skill sets, even the affections we're going to need so that something like human belonging, and not just belonging, but even communion, can happen? What kinds of people do we need to become so that we feel that our own identity is wrapped up in the well-being of the places that we live in? And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, as Paul said, I grew up farming in southern Alberta, and I farmed with my family and my grandfather and a number of other European immigrants who had settled into Western Canada in the 1950s. And they believed that farming was supposed to be small scale. It was supposed to be as labor intensive as it needed to be so that you could exercise adequate care. And one of the most important people in this growing up period for me was one of my grandfathers who came to farm with us, really exhibited a kind of gentleness and patience with his farm animals that I have never seen since. But he absolutely loved his farm. And you have to understand, I grew up in the shadow of the Canadian Rockies, and it's spectacular. And in all of the years that I spent with him, we were able to get him to leave his farm for a day in the Rockies at Waterton Glacier Park. And I remember it was a beautiful day, and we were out walking in this alpine meadow, and it's blue sky, there are wildflowers, the air is so fragrant, it's simply spectacular. And I say to my grandfather, who I called Opa, I said, Opa, is this not the most wonderful place to be? And he said, you know, Norman, it truly is. It's spectacular. But when can I go home? I miss my farm. I miss my animals. And I remember just being struck by that, because this was not a sentimental or naive kind of affection that he had for his farm, because the farm was the place of his work, and the work was hard. It was long. It was often frustrating. And the animals that he longed to be with were also animals that could kill him, as in the case of a bull. And so he understood that this was not a romantic kind of attachment to the land. It was a deep, embodied attachment to his place. And he felt happiest when he knew that the land was taking care of his family, providing for his needs. And he felt best when he contributed to the flourishing of his land and the flourishing of his animals. And it reflected itself in multiple daily activities, so that he was constantly working to try to make his farm more beautiful, more functional. And that meant well taken care of buildings. It meant a gentle demeanor with the animals. It meant patience and care for how he grew his crops. And this kind of realization in his life, I think, is so uncommon in our time, because so many people are in jobs where they live for the weekend, or they're constantly being distracted. And the prospect of getting to the Rockies and then saying, I'd rather be back in my office, is almost incomprehensible to so many people. But he had this unusual experience, I think, a really noble and praiseworthy experience, which is that the well being of his place was also his own well being. And so he was happiest when his animals were happy. And I think what is at work in this way of living, this way of working, is a profound understanding that he had, that he lived in a world that is a gift. The whole of his life, the whole of his farm, the animals, he understood all of them to be gifts. And part of this is a feature of his growing up in a church environment, but part of it is that he also had the experience of knowing that when he gave himself to his animals in caring for them, they provided for him. And it was a provision for him that he didn't control. And I think this is a very important point to pause on, because I think for many of us who make our way through life by shopping for the things that we need, whether that be food or clothing or the homes that we buy, we don't have the experience that the world is a gift, because everything appears to us as a commodity. And I'm not opposed to shopping, I'm not opposed to having commodities, but we have to understand that when we engage a world that we believe to be a stockpile of commodities, we're going to treat it differently. We're going to assume that once we purchase it, it is ours to do with. And given the kind of food industry that we live in, we're going to try to do our shopping according to some very important criteria, which are primarily convenience and cheapness of price. And we know that convenience and cheapness of price, while from a shopping point of view, are really wonderful things. But when you look at the other side, on the production side, we know that the cheapness of our food is making life very difficult for our farmers. It's making them engage in practices that degrade the land and often abuse animals. And we can get into some of that in the conversation later on about what's actually happening in a highly commodified, industrialized food and agricultural system. But in that kind of a world, there is little possibility that the creatures or the land itself will appear as a gift. And I'll again give an example from my grandfather, because I think it just makes the point so clearly. Let's just choose one item in a grocery store that a lot of people like in this country, obviously, uh, chicken. If you go to a store to purchase chicken, one of the things that you're going to be looking for is not just that the chicken looks good, but that the chicken is convenient and as cheaply priced as possible. And because chicken growers know this about us, they have tried to find ways to raise chickens in as profitable and as efficient a manner as possible. And this means that chickens are raised in confinement operations where they are locked within usually dark, massive structures, thousands at a time, never see sunlight, and are fed a regimen of enhanced foods so that they can get to slaughter weight in a much, much quicker time than a chicken that would be raised in a normal free range sort of way. And this is very, very difficult on chickens, because if it takes roughly 90 days for a chicken to get to mature slaughter weight, we can now do it in about 50 or 55 days. The trouble with this and this system, which is very, very efficient, very productive, is that it abuses the life of the chicken. What the chicken wants, what the chicken desires, is completely ignored, because the demand to produce as many as possible, as quickly as possible, overrides what we might characterize as the sanctity of that chicken's life. Now, contrast that with the way my grandfather raised his chickens. They were free range, and that was obviously a thing before we talked about it in those terms. But I remember from spring until fall time, usually right after lunch, he would grab his scythe and a bucket and he would go find some grass, usually about 6 to 8 inches tall, and he would cut it and put it in the bucket, and he would walk toward the chicken coop. And these chickens would see him coming, and this had become a ritual because they knew what he was doing. They knew that he was bringing them freshly cut grass. And as he would approach the chickens would come running toward him. And I don't know if you've ever seen a chicken smile, but chickens can smile. They were very, very happy. And they would jump in the air in joy because my grandfather would throw the grass in the air and he would smile. And I never asked him why he did it. I just know that he did it and was often with him when he did it. But as I reflect upon that now, I think, first of all, this was a completely unnecessary thing for him to do, because these chickens could get their own grass. They could go anywhere they wanted. They could get grubs, they could get grass, they could get insects, they could do whatever. But he felt that these chickens were a gift that were given to him by God. And so if he was going to receive the gift, he had to also give himself to the chickens to provide for the happiness that he could give them. Now, obviously, we raised the chickens, we butchered the chickens, and we ate them. But we also knew that these were chickens who were cared for. And this brings us to a very, very important insight, I think, which is that when you understand that the world that you live in is a gift, the most important thing you have to learn to do is to learn to receive it gratefully. And, we can say gratitude by simply saying the words thank you, but that's just to register that a gift has happened. But the gift really does its transformative work in people when they turn themselves into gifts to others. And a way to put this, I think, is to say that receiving a gift really takes hold and transforms you from within when you learn to become generous with others. Put another way, to receive a gift is to also to be willing to share what you have with others. And this, of course, becomes very, very important when we think about how we raise our food, but also then how we think about the production, the preparation, and then also the presenting of food. And I think this is something that people who are in gardens will often experience, which is that the garden produces so much. It produces often in surprising ways. I mean, I get potatoes every year, even if I haven't planted them, because there are, obviously spuds that stuck in the ground, and they come, and tomatoes come. And often you get in the garden things that are well beyond any of our deserving or planning. And as a gardener, you know that you don't have control over this life that comes, disease or blight or pests or bad weather. So many things can intervene. And so when you do have a delicious tomato or you have a succulent raspberry, it's such a different kind of experience because you understand something about the fragility of its coming to be, but also something of the grace of its coming to be, the generosity of its coming to be. And this brings us to, I think, a really important insight, which is if food is not a commodity, it is a gift instead. One of the ways we should actually characterize food is to say that food is God's love made delicious, or food is God's love made nutritious. Now, I know that's a rather strange way of speaking, but if you think about this, and you've been with people who have grown food or with people who prepare meals for you, you know that the preparation and the presentation of a meal is always a declaration of love, right? I know I hope you've had the experience of coming to someone's home, and they want to give you food and they want to give you something that will taste good, and they enjoy your company. It's a scene of hospitality, and it's a mirroring from a theological point of view of God's own hospitality in creating the world at all. Right? So when theologians ask, why does God make anything, let alone anything that tastes delicious or smells fragrant or is beautiful? The answer that theologians have come up with is that God loves for something other than God to be, and then welcomes that into God's life of nurture and provision and care. And in that nurture, empowers the creature to more fully become itself. This is what we do when we prepare food for guests that come to our home. We say, we love you. We want you to be well fed. I had a grandmother who would invite me in, and I'll just eat, and then I'll say, I can't eat. Oh, I'm full. And she says, no, you have to eat. You have to eat. I say, I can't. And she would cry. And she was crying, maybe it's because of looking at me, but I think she was crying because I wasn't just rejecting her food, I was rejecting her love. And so don't underestimate the power of sharing food, preparing food for each other as an expression of having received this love that comes to us in the freshness and the vitality and the succulence of food. This gives us also, I think, one last point that I want to make, which is that what's it all for? I mean, why do we eat? Why do we grow food? Why do we grow gardens? And the answer is sometimes so simple, but we often forget it. We don't eat just to fuel our bodies. At least the best eating isn't just about that. The best eating is to experience communion. The best eating is to experience belonging. The best eating is to experience delight. And this too comes to a theological point, which is when God creates the world, if you think about that famous 7-day story of creation that we get at the start of Scripture, the last day is not human beings being the kings and queens of the heap with everything existing for their benefit. No, the seventh day is coming to rest in the goodness of the world, coming to rest in the beauty of the world. Because what God does on that first Sabbath sunrise is see reflected back in all the sensual forms God's own love, made nutritious, made beautiful, made fragrant, made audible and tactile. And so when we eat and we make a good meal, the point is to experience there the love of God that is always communicating itself through the fruitfulness, the fertility, and the flowering of our lands, and is being then taken up by us so that we can share it with a world that is so very hungry, that is so very lonely and alienated. And so, if you can understand that food is a gift, that it's God's love made nutritious, and that to receive the gift, we not only have to become grateful and humble people, but we also try to work to become generous people who then share it with a world in need. I think we've made a huge, huge step, which has the benefit of not just resulting in a better agriculture where we take care of land, we take care of animals, we take care of plants, but we also learn to take care of each other in the kinds of food systems that make sure that nobody is hungry, that make sure nobody is eating alone or in isolation. And I think that's a pretty remarkable transformation. And I invite you for the journey.
Thank you so much, Norman, for that introduction, for a great, great, great basis for our conversation. And as we kind of transition to talking among ourselves about some of the points that you raised, just want to invite the folks out there in the world again to add any questions you might want to ask to our Q&A, and we'll take those up in turn in due time as we go on. So first of all, that just in that spirit of gratitude, in that spirit of sharing, thank you for sharing your wisdom, your insights, which I really love. You know, every time that I've read your work, every time that I teach your work, you know, the reflection of the experience and the way that story, you know, informs that, and the stories you've told of your grandparents, in reflecting on that, I think just adds something really powerful, a sort of depth of insight that doesn't just, you know, tell us about, you know, gardening or relationships or theology, but shows us what it's like when this gets lived out, when this gets put into the concrete. And I really, really appreciated that a great deal. So thank you. To kind of, you know, start our conversation on that note, you got me thinking about story. And of course, you know, within the Christian tradition, you know, the Christian tradition is a tradition that lives by its stories, that lives through its stories, within its stories. And you took us back to Genesis, to the first couple of chapters of the Bible there. And as you were talking about that, and speaking about, you know, the importance, and I love Kimmerer's work, you know, the braiding sweetgrass that you mentioned, which I think, Catherine, we've talked about before as well. You know, thinking about the way that, let's say Genesis 2, the second story of creation, you know, not to get into the weeds of that too much here. But
There's a lot of weeds.
yeah, lots of weeds there in that garden, right? But this distinction that you drew out of Kimmer about, you know, living on the land versus living from the land, and how intimately our bodies are tied to the ecosystems, but also to the bodies of other creatures, you know, as with your grandfather and the chickens, but also throughout our whole evolutionary history. For as long as we have been on this planet as hominids, we have been living in relationship to what's around us. And the reason our bodies look the way they do now, the reason why we walk upright on two legs and have the kind of brains we have, is because of the ecological connections that we had over the course of our history, right? Like our access to food, our access to cook food. This is an evolutionary thing, it's an ecological thing, and it's all kind of there in us, as you said. That history lives in each of our bodies. And I think that that's such a fascinating thing. So thinking that together with Genesis 2 and with the act of gardening, perhaps the vocation of the gardener to till and keep, you know, that Genesis 2 talks about, connecting that up with Catherine's work with students at the Forge and what the Forge does, and, you know, with food as an act of service. I was thinking that maybe we could start by thinking about this idea of being creatures, being from the land, and being sort of, at least as Genesis 2 presents it, kind of composite creatures, right? We are dirt and breath, those two things. And interestingly enough, right, in the imagination of that biblical author, the dirt that we are and the breath that we breathe, neither of those belongs to us. You know, we are brought up, little clay creatures, brought up out of dirt that is there before us, the dirt of the garden. And the breath that is breathed into us is God's own breath, the breath of life, which, you know, as the story unfolds a little bit later on, is connected with all other creatures, like in the story of Noah, you know, every living being with the breath of life in it. So, in a very sort of literal sense, but also in the sort of beautiful imaginative sense, we're breathing the same air, but that air is not ours. It's not of us in the biblical imagination. It comes from God. It is the gift of life given from the outside. And so when you were talking about gratitude, when you're talking about contact with life processes, these kinds of things, I got to thinking, just as a way of kind of starting our discussion about how, you know, everything that we are, both in the biblical imagination, but also in what gardening teaches us, what the act of gardening teaches us, everything that we are, everything that allows us to exist, it's not our own. It is something that emerges in relationship, emerges in contact with others, whether divine others or whatever. So I was wondering, you know, if we could reflect a little bit more together on this idea of, you know, things like shared breath, being creatures of breath and dirt, and then, you know, thinking about gardening, thinking about the forge, thinking about that work, how in particular contact with life processes, with getting our hands in the dirt and working with the dirt to bring things out of it, can foster that kind of awareness, that sensibility that you were talking about, to the way that our life intersects and is informed by the lives of others. So there's a lot there just to kind of throw out for us to talk about, but either Catherine, Norman, I'm wondering if you could kick us off, think through that a little bit.
You go ahead, Catherine, you start.
All right. Yeah, I think that, you know, when I look at a garden, I really think of it as an ecosystem that, you know, often we within that ecosystem, there's these checks and balances, right? And when things are kind of, you know, swayed in one direction, we can get, you know, problems, right? And when that checks and balances system is not quite in alignment, we start to see pest problems, we start to see other issues that arise. And the more that, you know, I see very much my role as a gardener as being not someone who's just growing food, right? That's the byproduct, right? That's the great thing at the end of the day, that we get to enjoy that wonderful food. But really my role is trying to maintain some of those checks and balances, and observing that ecosystem and noticing what it needs. And when, you know, I think that when we have that alignment, we really see things come together. When that alignment is off balance, you know, I think we can also see these issues go beyond just the garden, right? So us as humans, we're a part of that ecosystem. We're not separate from it. We're in it. And our social issues that, you know, we see lots of health problems as a result of, you know, I would say some of these ecosystem checks and balances are out of whack. The way that we are industrially farming is harming our ecosystem, and that's resulting in health issues. We're seeing folks that aren't able to access healthy foods and are unable to obtain foods, and again, I think that's an example of where that ecosystem is not in balance.
Yeah. That's really important. I think, you know, when I have students and we talk about this stuff in a classroom, and then they go and they work in a garden, maybe do a summer internship or something like that, and I'll see them after the internship and they'll say, I had no idea. Being in the garden doing the work was utterly transformative, because you can talk about these things in your head, But when you actually do the work, something really important happens. And there's lots of ways to describe it. And this connects to something that you were saying, Paul, about how we are soil and divine breath. We're not ourselves. You know, if people could learn that lesson, it would be huge. Because when you're a gardener and a farmer, at least a good one, that doesn't, I've met farmers and gardeners who are very arrogant, so they're not good ones. But when you are in a garden or you're on a farm, there's a kind of unselfing that happens because your attention devotes itself to the plants, to the soil, to the animals, to what they need. And so you wake up asking not what do I want, but what does it need? And that's a transformation of who we are. And I think, and here too, I think there's a critique of not just Western philosophy, but also I think a lot of Western theology, which has tried to convince people that you are this thing that is your particular self that you're supposed to hold on to. And we get this kind of dualism where we do think there's this thing that is our inviolable self. And we have to be very careful about that way of speaking, because I think the language that you get in Genesis about human beings is a combination of soil and borrowed breath is actually a true description of who we are, even scientifically, not just theologically. And so one of the biggest and most important things for us to learn is to figure out how to calm down the ego so that we can understand ourselves as part of processes that are unbelievably complicated in places that are also so diverse and have so many different needs.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you're making me think immediately, of course, of Descartes and, I think, therefore I am, right? Two singular and implicitly masculine, make sure we're observing that as well, pronouns, I, and that the emphasis there, right, is on thinking. And, Norman, you've written about the idea, the evolution of the word culture, for example, how it's gone from meaning the land, the act of cultivation, all of that network of meanings, to the sort of refinements, the intellectual and social refinements of sort of human society away from the land, right? And so the idea that we get, I think you're right to say, philosophy, theology as well, especially in the era after the Enlightenment, like this emphasis on the individual thinking, rational person really ultimately is an anthropocentric concept, right? It leans toward our the difference our type of thinking makes, in as opposed to other kinds of creatures who don't think in those same ways. So look at us, Homo sapiens, the wise humans, as opposed to all the dumb animals, or
Yeah,
some.
and it's reflected in America in the particular form, I think, in the kind of individualism that we see, neoliberal philosophy, if you want to put it that way, where we think that we make ourselves, we're responsible for ourselves. So whatever we have, we deserve. And when we fail, it's our own fault, right? It's a double-edged sword. It's really tough on people because it all depends on you.
Yeah.
And I think that notion about the individual self-made person has been so destructive to the way we think about our societies and the way we think about work. And here too, again, I think, growing food, learning to share food works to undermine that way of thinking because we understand how much we depend. We depend on weather. We depend on plant photosynthesis. We depend on soil decomposition. If any of these things didn't happen, we'd be dead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking, Catherine, whenever we visited the Forge, you always do such a wonderful job, and maybe this is something you could talk a little bit about, building on this interdependence theme, but also something, Norman, you said in your opening comments about learning from the land, taking the time to actually like learn how the processes work, and basically rather than forcing them to work how we want them to work, which is this very sort of technocratic, overlord sort of mentality, working within them or with them alongside the processes as they naturally function in order to sort of maximize the productivity of a garden, recognizing that the gardens can get along just fine. Those potatoes, the spuds are going to sprout and grow again and again, even if you didn't plant them, that kind of thing. So Catherine, just to get like really concrete with it, in your experience working with the Forge, you've talked about how you plant things in certain configurations to increase pollination, or this, that, and the other thing. How do you see that playing out? What have you learned, Catherine, from the act of gardening, both sort of in an ecological sense, ecosystemic function, that kind of stuff, but also on the level of like what it means to sort of nurture and nourish life? Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, Paul. With I think that one of the things I tell the students that I work with is that let the garden be your teacher, right? You know, I can share things with you that I've learned over the years, but I really want students to learn the observational skills of observing the garden and understanding what's going on, because you can do this work for a lifetime and still never be an expert. There's always more to learn from every year to year. As climate change is coming, we're seeing seasonal changes that no one's seen before, and so we need to be observers of this world that we live in, and making those observations and then learning and seeing what happens from it, right? So when certain pest outbreaks happen, are we noticing, what insects are we noticing in the garden that are coming in and eating those insects? If we're not observing, we're not going to notice that interaction at play. And then, maybe there's a specific plant that we can grow to have more of those beneficial insects and foster that habitat for the insect community. And that's where we step in. We say, okay, let's grow a little more of this, or let's we're able to produce more when we are utilizing this specific technique for caring for our soil. Really we want to be caring for our soil, and that's the number one thing that we can do to grow healthy plants and to have a healthy ecosystem, is increasing that soil biology. And so I think being in tune with the space is number one, and we can't do that when we have lots of distractions. And I think that when we're able to do that, and we're also able to come together and enjoy the fruits of our labor and have those moments of shared meals together, it just makes it all worth it, right? All the hard work and everything that we're putting into the space, it makes it that much more fruitful and willing to make those sacrifices of hard work for our food.
So Catherine, how do you deal with the frustration that happens when you're in a garden, right? Because we can romanticize gardening, but if you're in it, it's hard because you discover you don't have control. There's a lot of ignorance and impotence. When students are in there, how do you help them handle the frustration that comes along the way?
Yeah, I think that's where having those successes, celebrating those successes when we are doing well and we do have, great harvest, and we can enjoy that and share that and share it with our community. And when we have failures, talking it through and just saying, hey, this is a part of it. We have a lot of those conversations with my team, when it can be really hard when you plant something and it, you have a pest outbreak and it's completely gone. And I think it's just being in community, and we're not doing this alone. We're in community and working together. Really allows for the ability to have that resilience and come back and keep working and keep trying and doing our best that we can.
That's huge in my mind, that you've got the sense that if something goes badly, you've got a community that's going to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different context in which we talk about something like humility, I think, right? If we think about humility as sort of self, loathing even, I think that's just terribly improper way of speaking about humility. Humility is knowing you're not in control. Humility is knowing you depend on the gifts of others. And I think it's important for us to know that life doesn't always go our way, and gardens will teach you that.
Mhm.
But if you're doing it in community, you also know that when it doesn't go your way, there are still others around that are looking out for you, and that there's some other part of the garden that maybe didn't die.
Right. Well, that's where, yeah, diversity is so important. If we had a monocropped garden and we were only growing one crop and that crop dies, well, then we're out of luck, right? But the more diversity we have, the more resilient that system is, and it, will provide for us. So if we have all of our broccoli dies, we still have lettuce and carrots and beets and radishes and turnips, and we're still able to eat. And I think that's where diversity is really important. And then that community, having other resources out, we're not the only ones growing our food. We have others in our community that we're sourcing from, our local farmers and our farmers markets, and we're able to draw from other folks in the community.
Yeah, I was thinking about the values. You mentioned resilience, Norman. You added humility. Patience is another one that came to mind. Um, Gardening is slow work, and that the patience that is required to sort of become comfortable with that difference, which is so different than our capitalistic. You can go to the supermarket and get whatever you want whenever you want it instantly. As you were saying, this is a different pattern, not only of production, but it's a different pattern of consumption as well. Because, Catherine, you always have pointed out, think 100 to 150 years ago, people couldn't get apples all year round. And in many parts of the world, you still can't. This is very much a function of privilege. It's a function of, the way that the American capitalist system works, that we can have whatever we want whenever we want it. And that stands in sharp contrast, I think, to that work of nurturing and growing and drawing life out in collaboration with this process that takes weeks or months or whatever it is, or years even, right, to get a garden when it's really able to produce. And I'm just reflecting on how different that is than many of the sort of demands and supposed values of progress, of growth, of what Pope Francis in Laudato Si calls rapidification. Things aren't just getting bigger; they're getting bigger faster. And the way that gardening kind of challenges us, I think, to think ourselves differently in these relationships, these slow, life-giving relationships. I love
Yeah,
that.
that's really important, Paul. And it's not just a kind of patience with the world. I think it's also that you need to learn a kind of patience with yourself.
Mm.
So it's not just that we impose upon a world that it has to be faster, better, bigger, more to our preference and liking, but then we start to put these demands on ourselves. And we got so many people who are exhausted and they beat themselves up because
Mm.
somebody else has got a CV that's longer than somebody else. And I know that, college students are dealing with this in a serious way because we're living in a world which is just so competitive
Mhm.
and we beat ourselves up so easily. And so the kind of patience that you're talking about, I think, is also something to be put upon ourselves so that we come to be a little gentler with ourselves and know that just as a garden has limits, we have limits. And so one of the very important things about the experience of Sabbath that I ended with is you got to stop. You can't just keep going and asking for more, more, more all the time, because in that you don't just ruin the life of the world, you also ruin your own life.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think about that, like the corn isn't concerned about whether the tomatoes are growing. The chickens aren't worried about the broccoli. It's having a bigger, better CV than than they do. It's just the whole sort of ecosystem. And I mean that in a not just a literal sort of ecosystemic way, but in the way that it teaches us about our place in the world and how we, I think it reveals to us that there are always more choices. Things don't have to be the way that we are taught that they are. We can choose to move and to live differently, even if we can't get out of the system or change whatever system we live within completely, we can move in it differently, in different ways, in creative ways. And I think that the act of gardening kind of, teaches us that. It's like, especially here in California, like one of my big excitements about being out here is you can grow stuff all year long. That's not the case, where I grew up in Indiana, at least not, easily, but that itself being a gift, right? The ability to kind of be in a place where life flourishes and you can be there in the processes and witness it and partake of it as well, but in a way, as you said, that is rooted in gratitude, rooted in care, thinks about where things come from, and cares about that, really values that as something that can change how we choose to get where we get our food from, how we choose to live and move in the world in these broader ways as well. Even along lines, thinking about some of the work, Catherine, that you all do with outreach, along the lines of like the intersection of food and social justice, reaching out to the Forge, reaches out to women's shelters, and serves communities that are in need. We think about the intersection of racism and food insecurity and things like that, and how a garden and the act of gardening can not only feed hungry people, great, but also teach us the value of being community with people who don't possess the same privilege that others do in a society. I think there's this broader network of learning that can come out of that that's really, really wonderful.
Yeah, I think that we've seen with the pandemic, in the very early days of the pandemic, there was food shortages. There was also people, all of a sudden quickly losing their jobs. And what I've seen, with our program, but also many other programs across the Bay Area and the country, a lot of these urban farms have kind of stepped up and provided resources for folks within the area to provide food access, often free, completely free of charge, or providing resources for people that needed it. When the pandemic hit here at the Forage Garden, we had a garden full of food, and we had to close down our farm stand. And I said, okay, what are we going to do with this? This needs to get harvested. And so we started putting together bags for folks that were in need of food. And we sent out our food to families that were in need. And so we actually continued with that program. It's called the Resiliency Bag Program, and we're serving 22 families a week. And it's grown quite a bit. Now we've added pantry items, and we've added activities for the kids and the families to engage with nature and get outside and bird watch and go on leaf walks and look for scavenger hunts and things like that as a part of that program. And we're not the only ones that are doing this. This is really where I think urban farms have really come up and shown the value in our communities that we can provide these resources to folks that are struggling, especially in times of crisis.
That's so great. Yeah.
That's really wonderful. So, Paul, you started out by saying the importance of stories. One of the things that I tell students to think about when engaging food is to understand that food is always a story too. Mm-hmm. That every food item is a story of its coming to be. And what we want to be able to figure out is when we eat the food that we do or grow the food that we do, what are the stories that are being embedded in it? Right? Are they stories that honor the life of the land, of the animals, the plants, and the eaters? Mm-hmm. And does our food system, right, does it also honor agricultural workers, food providers, distribution center workers, all these different links along the line of foods coming to be? It's all storied. And I think what's a bit sad about so much of our food economy is how anonymous it is. Mm-hmm. Stuff shows up as a product in a package, and we don't know the story. But when you're growing food in an urban garden, people can know from the beginning the story of that tomato or whatever, and see and trace its life into a community, out of a community. And that just gives a different flavor to what the food is, I think.
Yeah. And I think you're right that that anonymity that you're talking about, the anonymity of our sort of food and where it comes from. I mean, it covers over so many, deeply entrenched issues of labor justice, of, so many things that our nation tradition, cares about and is passionate about, race and ethnicity and class. All of these things are wrapped up in this question of where food comes from, migration, et cetera, are live issues in the system. And I think that, in so many ways, we've talked a lot about the difference between, say, industrial agriculture and urban farming, agrarian life, how they value those in different ways. And here, for the folks out there that have never visited the forge or the garden that stands, the Duke has as well, here we're talking about, urban gardens. We're talking about a half acre surrounded by houses and driveways and cars, and yet one of the first things that Catherine always points out whenever, my students have visited is that how different the sound of the garden is, even once you get into the center of it, how you hear birds and you hear insects and you hear things that you don't hear when you're just, 50 feet away, standing in the middle of the street outside the garden. So just attuning ourselves, I think, to that experience. And then, as you said, Norman, the story that's connected with that experience, is such a powerful thing. I want to use that maybe as a way into some of the audience questions, folks' questions that are coming in here, and also to bridge that with one other point in what you were saying in your opening remarks, Norman, as well. And that is that you spoke a lot about the production, the preparation, and the presentation of food. I love those three P's, production, preparation, and presentation. And I love to cook. I love to bake. Whenever in non-COVID times, I always bring like goodies to my classes and stuff. And this is a big part of who I am, and a big part of the family that I grew up in. Met over food, gathered over food. Constantly. My grandmother on my dad's side cooking, these big feasts every Sunday that we would all, come together and eat with other members of the family, and then big family gatherings. And we're those kind of people. We love food, and both the preparation, the consumption, all of that. But to do that in a way, as you said, that really is about being more than about feeding your family, just sort of like in a practical sense, but about generosity, about building community, about communion, the power of that kind of stuff. So, thinking about the ways that different forms of agriculture intersect with those three P's of production, preparation, and presentation. And, thinking about, say, the vocation, we could say, to till and keep out of Genesis 2, or perhaps in Genesis 1, that interesting, verb structure. God says, let there be, let the earth bring forth, right? It's not, I'm putting this there, I'm forcing this to grow out of the ground, but let it be abundant, let it produce, let it happen, such that there's almost an autonomy that's evoked there, an agency that's evoked on the part of the land and on the part of the water to be a system of life. There's something really beautiful in that. So thinking about that, Dan Scheid, Dan, thanks for being with us, has put in the chat mention of, I think, a question that is super relevant to our Santa Clara University community and the Ignatian Center, talking about different forms of farming and this move from something that is more industrial to a project that his neighbor is doing, non-GMO, pesticide-free, sustainably grown in human-free biodomes, this fifth season, and there's a link in the chat there. But it looks to me like the emphasis here is on this idea that robotics and AI are helping to keep fresh greens on shelves year round. That's part of their self-description. So Dan is asking, I think, a great question. Is this a helpful part, employing engineering knowledge, robotics and AI to assist in growing sustainably, right? Note the sustainably, the non-GMO, the pesticide-free, or is it a distraction from what, agrarianism can provide in the relatedness to the earth and the land that you've described? You both have described so beautifully. We think about that for the engineers in our audience, the engineering students in our audience. You've talked about biomimicry as well, Norm, and in some of your work. What do y'all think about that?
That's a great question. It's also a tricky one because there's so many layers that I want to unpack in that sort of a question. Because on the one hand, one of the very important things about the experience of gardening, the embodied experience, is precisely to teach you your dependence, but also you're being benefited by the land. And so the effort to extricate human beings from that whole process of food production, I can see how it can be helpful because I know that engineering and technologies have done a lot of good things along the way to help with food production, agricultural production. But I'm also a little bit concerned about the possibility that we're going to develop technologies that finally make human beings irrelevant altogether. And we know that this is a serious issue for a number of communities where robots, AI are taking the position of people doing what could be honorable work. One of the sort of hallmarks of the agrarian position is that it's not just that we have an aesthetic attachment, but we have an embodied attachment to land. And that attachment works itself out in labor. And I want to be very quick to say, I don't want to romanticize the labor because it's very, very hard. But at the same time, it's also very, very important because it teaches us so much that we need to know about the kind of world we live in and the kind of beings that we ourselves are as needy and vulnerable and always in search of nurture. And if technologies develop that interfere with that kind of mutual flourishing, mutual understanding, I guess I've got questions about it. And the question would be, first of all, what's the end game here? Is it just to have a cool sort of device that does some really amazing things? Or is it to actually come alongside to assist human beings in food production? The assisting part I like quite a lot. But if it's to make human beings obsolete, I'm not so interested in that.
Mm.
Yeah, this is a question that I receive a lot. We have lots of engineering students that come out to the garden and want to build something cool and find a solution. And sometimes I question, are we finding a solution that isn't already existing here in this natural space? Because our sun and soil do a pretty good job of growing food. However, I certainly do see how we need a diversified approach to solving some of the big food system issues that we're facing. And so there's maybe a time and a place for this type of technology in really cool climates. I would say here where we are in Santa Clara, we're harvesting, lots of food year round, every single week. And we're, I question if it really is more productive in our climate. However, there certainly are climates where it might make sense to have some fresh greens grown indoors year round. But I think we need to think about, there's not going to be one ticket solution to the issues that we're facing with our food system. We're really going to need a diversified approach, and we really do need people from all different sectors working on these issues together. So what I would say is having engineers that are working on this type of work, really working alongside farmers and folks that understand ecological systems, so that they can work together to find valuable solutions that are really benefiting our food system overall.
It's great. Thank you both. I'm thinking as you were both speaking, Norman, as you spoke in particular about this question of romanticization. We have a question in from Ben Holman in as well about that. And Ben notes that, your comments, Ben comes from a farming family, and that your comments reminded him of many stories that have been passed down, nearly all of which included some memorable injury. And I think this is pretty normal, we're thinking about farming and gardening. So Ben is asking, without romanticizing the pains and the dangers that farmers face, these stories also highlighted the toughness, or maybe Catherine, to your word earlier, the resilience among farmers who often sacrifice their own comfort and even, their bodies in pursuit of making the farm work. So, you know, our society, Ben says, is so marked by the elevation of various comforts, or what once would have been seen as a comfort, to necessity status, to that level of something that we all need. In the midst of that, how can urban agrarians reclaim that farmer virtue? And Ben asked, does theology have a role to play here? I'm just going to say, of course it does. So I'm going to ask the question, what role does theology have to play in offering an answer to that? So I'd throw that out to the both of you if you have any thoughts.
Okay, so one that I have is when I do a course on food and farming at the Div School here at Duke, many of the students have not got farming experience. And so I say part of the class is for you to grow some food during the semester, and you can pick what it is. And so I'll say, you know, if you're really nervous, just grow a lettuce. If you're really ambitious, you can go for something else, but just try a lettuce. And it's remarkable how many of them, because I tell them to keep a journal of what they encounter along the way. And the journals, so many of them, they stop after about 4 weeks, because they say, well, first of all, I had real trouble even finding soil. I didn't know where to get seed. I didn't know how far to put the seed into the soil. I didn't know how much to water. I forgot to water, and basically I killed it. And I say, now reflect upon that. And one of the things they say is, I just couldn't give the time to the life of a plant. And I thought, this is really remarkable, because if we can't take care of a simple lettuce, how are we going to take care of each other? And it's about learning habits of attention. And, you know, growing a lettuce, the sacrifice is pretty minimal, right? Because it's not a whole lot that you're giving up. You're not really risking limb like you are in some kinds of agricultural work. And I know about that. But it's just the opening of an insight that we so much want the world on our own terms. And having to take care of just one plant teaches you that maybe the assumptions that we have in so many domains of life are just skewed and wrong-headed, because the world isn't on our terms. And that's partly what a world of suffering is. It's the realization that everything in the world isn't set up for you to be comfortable. And you know, we talk about how delicious the world is. We also need to know there's stuff you shouldn't eat, because if you eat it, you'll die, because it'll kill you. So you have to be smart in the world if you're going to do well in it.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, I think thinking of the whole conversation tonight has repeatedly emphasized this theme. You know, in learning about that relationship with the land, how does it teach us something about who we are as people, and how we relate not only to the land, not only in the act of gardening, but also to other people. And you know, Catherine's example of you know, connecting with hungry people in the local community is a great, you know, illustration of that. One of our other questions kind of gets at that, and I'm going to weave together two different questions kind of into one and throw them on the table here. One is that we've somebody with us tonight who recently moved to a 40-acre hay farm after a career as a CPA. And this transition to this new sort of context has taught them many things, including that people who, you know, aren't urban in the way that we often imagine it, and who often have very little formal education, have incredible knowledge about how to manage the land, and have taught him so much about how to manage the land. And has, you know, out of that experience come to sort of a new awareness of sort of the equality and the interrelatedness of people as well. And at the same time, now here's to bring in a different question, we're talking a lot about balancing the care that we need to show to our food systems and ecosystems with the reality that inequality exists around the world, and there are billions of people who are living in starvation. So, you know, if we have a food system currently, like the industrial food system, that does produce more faster, and we have all these hungry people, how do we undo the negative practices of those industrial practices, while not leaving those who are abused by these systems that keep them hungry also in immediate health and economic danger. So it's sort of both, what can we learn about each other, and then how do we apply that to engaging and entering into the realities that we're discussing when we talk about like lack of access to food and things like that.
Yeah, I think these skills, the skills of farming are ancestral. Most of the work that I'm doing, most of it is not innovative and new, right? These aren't things that are new. I'm not really utilizing many new technologies or many new ideas. Many of these ideas have come from indigenous communities around the globe. Things like cover cropping and composting and planting, companion planting, and that knowledge has tremendous value that I think has been often overlooked by academics and our kind of modern world. And I think that we really need to turn to folks that have some of that knowledge to value those folks and provide platforms for them to share their valuable knowledge with the rest of us. And I think that more and more universities are starting to kind of be aware of this and provide those pathways for folks that have this knowledge to share it with the academic world.
Yeah.
I think the question about equality is a really, really important one. And I think we just need to be very clear that the history of agriculture is a history of inequality. It's a history of coerced labor, often enslaved labor. And a lot of that has to do with the systems in which people control food, because if you control food, you control people. And that's just been the story of agriculture from the very, very beginning. And so we have to talk not about the farmers just themselves, we have to talk about the systems in which they try to grow the food and recognize that those systems can often be terribly unjust. I mean, the American story is, of course, a pretty well-known one, that right, we wouldn't have agriculture in this country had there not been a history of slavery or indentured servitude. And now today, obviously, with migrant workers who are growing a lot of our food, harvesting our food, they're not getting paid a living wage, not getting the kind of worker protections in many instances. So that's something that consumers need to be aware of so that they can try to support farmers who are doing better things, and that as eaters, we can become citizens who advocate for a system that is more just, that is more equal. Because it's not the land that discriminates, it's people who do the discriminating. I know Bell Hooks has written about this, where she talks about how one of the most damaging thing to African Americans to have happened is to lose connection with the land, because the land does not discriminate against African American people. If you give your land, you give your love to the land, it loves you back. And so for people to have been cut off from the land because of histories of racism, and then landlessness and land theft, which is the story of the USDA, that's a social cultural tragedy, and that needs to be addressed.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, and bringing in those things. And I was thinking too, as y'all responded to the question, that in the question about industrial, farming and hunger, global hunger, industrial farming is not solving global culture. In fact, it often is worsening it. And so those two things are still in existence together, and I think that reveals a big part of the problem, as well as the fact that to bring in colonization, coloniality, in that history, when the first colonizers came to the U.S., what is now the U.S., they saw lands that looked untidy. They weren't gardens as they understood gardens to be, but these were carefully managed ecosystems that the indigenous folks who were here before they arrived were managing carefully. But typically not in order to maximize production for humans, but to maximize the circular regularity and the integrity of the whole ecosystem, so that there were always enough plants to feed enough deer to provide for the needs of the community, that then would allow to nourish in this sort of circular thing. So I think a lot of it has to do with how we perceive the relationships, and being able to imagine, new ways of perceiving and opening up ourselves to the world. And like one of our participants, one of my students, Yvonne, has asked this question, like, this sounds great, but do you think that we're ever going to be able to get there? Are we in too deep with our capitalistic mindset and what that brings? And that's a question I get a lot from my students. And so maybe we can kind of conclude with that question, thinking from another question as well, like towards a system where both the consumer and the producer view the earth as a gift rather than a commodity. Like, can we make that change? Can we change our experience in that way? What's something you would suggest to people going home tonight to start moving in that direction?
I think one thing I would recommend is just to learn the stories about some of the food that you like to eat, and then try to commit to supporting stories that you can honor, because they respect life and they nurture life, and that it takes some time, because learning the stories of where your food comes from is not always an easy thing. But when you have food that you are able to serve to somebody that you care about, and you know that this food has been well provided, it brings a dimension of joy to your experience. And I think it opens up the possibility for this sense of belonging and communion and kinship that I mentioned earlier. And I think we're in a world now where people are so desperate, right? COVID might actually be an opportunity in which people have had some time to reflect on what really matters. And I think one thing that people are seeing is how important it is to have good relationships and to be able to share life together. And food is one of the best ways to just grow together, but also share together. And maybe that can be a way, if we get leaders who can sort of build on that, to make a kind of cultural shift. But can we end capitalism? That's the huge question.
Yeah, I think this is hard. I think I see a lot of students that really struggle learning about all these challenges in our food system, and what can I do, and there are things that you can do, and what I would suggest to folks that are interested in starting to just start cooking, right? Get in your kitchen, just start cooking. Don't worry too much, about every detail, but just get in your kitchen and learn to cook, and talk to your family. What are some of those cultural recipes that are a part of your family? What food traditions have you grown up with that you want to continue into your life, that you want to keep around? There's so much value in that cultural food traditions. And so talk to your grandma about what that recipe that she makes is, and try making it. You can grow something, grow a little container garden, grow some sprouts. We have a mushroom cultivating workshop coming up in a couple weeks. You can learn how to grow your own mushrooms, and just learn from that process. All of those things can be done in an apartment, without a lot of resources. And then, getting out in your community and learning from others, going to your farmers markets and trying to eat seasonally. If you live here in Santa Clara, we can eat amazing food seasonally. But there are some little sacrifices you might have to make, right? You're not going to eat bell peppers in December, but you can eat butternut squash and beets and kale, and so having those skills of cooking really helps you if you can start playing around with different foods in your kitchen, and getting to know your farms, the local farms, who's in the area that is doing this work, because they're providing so many resources for our land, our water, our soil, as well as our community. And so the more that if we're able to support those folks, we're able to allow more folks to be able to do that type of work.
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, all of this is about living into our stories, living into our relationships. And I love, Norman, that you brought in that virtue of joy, which I think is one of the most underutilized and undervalued virtues in our contemporary society, to find joy in the making, to find joy in the eating, and to share that joy with others, and to come to that deep spirit of gratitude out of that. I think that to me is the big thing I'm taking away. So thank you, Norman. Thank you, Catherine, for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron, who's going to bring us to a close, tell us about the second event in this series and a couple other things coming up. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. It's been really great to be with you.
Thanks, Paul. I want to echo, oh, sorry, Catherine. I want to echo Paul's thanks to Norman and Catherine for a great event. As he said, I kind of came up with the idea of something I was interested in myself. So selfishly, you know, I talked to Paul about if this could be possible, and I couldn't have imagined a better event kind of out of that discussion and inspiration. So I want to thank everyone who was here, and especially the panelists for such a great, or Norman for his great talk, and Catherine and Paul for the conversation after. I do want to talk about a panel coming up next week that is a follow-up to this conversation. It'll be February 25th. Reimagining creation and interreligious dialogue on ecological and social justice. And we'll continue a lot of these themes, looking at it from a kind of interreligious perspective with a panel next week. And I think it'll be a great kind of, I don't know what word, relational conversation to this one today. So thank you all for being here. Hopefully you can make it next week. But again, to Norman and Catherine and Paul, thanks so much for a great event, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Right. Take care.